Sang-Yup Lee, Assistant Professor of Buddhist Philosophy at the Department of Philosophy, and I'm the moderator of today's event. And I would like to first welcome Professor Sam Vermish from the Department of Religious Studies.
I heard about this event a long time ago, and I was looking very much forward to it, but I only knew that I had to introduce Professor Kieschnick about 15 minutes ago. So I didn't prepare any very detailed notes, but anyway, you can easily Google all the details. That is no problem. And very conveniently, my office is located just on top, so I'm always on call. And I always know that there's something going on here because I can hear the reverb of the microphone from my office. So I came to know Professor Kieschnick probably when I was still studying in London at SOAS, where I did my degree. And I believe at one time you were at Bristol University. And maybe we crossed paths in one of the UK ABS conferences where I used to go. But fortunately, today is actually the first time I meet him in person. So the first time I got to know him through his work is through this work, The Eminent Monk, which I used as an inspiration also for my own work. And I have to confess here that I wrote an article inspired by that entitled The Eminent Koryo Monk, which is unfortunately much less famous than this book. And then Professor Kieschnick also published two other path-breaking works, The Impact of Buddhism on Chinese Material Culture, and Buddhist Historiography in China is his latest work, which I am reading now, which is actually very useful for my research, this recent research. I should also add that normally the person who should be doing this is Professor Kim Byung-jun, who is the director of the Center of Asian Studies. But unfortunately, he was indisposed, and that is how I have to kind of step in at short notice. So I'm very much looking forward to this presentation, and I would like to welcome Professor Kieschnick and invite everybody a warm round of applause to welcome Professor Kieschnick.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to the Institute for Asian Studies for inviting me. Thanks to Mr. Ko, Mr. Kim for help with the logistics, and thanks most of all to Professor Lee for giving me this opportunity to come to Korea and speak to you all. I've recently started a book that I hope will be a general history of Chinese vegetarianism, from ancient times up to the present. And this project is turning out to be a lot more complicated than I thought it would be. It's complicated because of all the different kinds of materials that are related to the history of food and vegetarianism. And it's complicated because of all of the fields that are involved. So it involves history, there's a little bit of anthropology, it involves philosophy and religion. And as I begin this project, I'm trying to figure out what matters in the history of Buddhist food. And this is where I hope I can have some of your input in a moment. In the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to make the case for 5 key elements in the history of Buddhist eating in China. And I'm hoping that in the time that remains for discussion, or maybe later if we don't have a chance to speak, that you might suggest terms and concepts that I have overlooked, or aspects of these 5 themes that I should consider. So as I prepared this talk, trying to boil down the history of Buddhist vegetarianism to key elements, these are the 5 words that I settled on. These are 5 elements or just areas of attention that have shaped the history of Buddhist eating in China. And those are yu, desire, ye, karma, ci, compassion, qing, purity, and finally wei, flavor. So we begin with the first term, yu, desire. And like all of the senses, discussion of food in Buddhist writing is informed by an appreciation for the destructive power of desire. According to classical Buddhist cosmology, the force that dominates our world, not just humans, but all creatures, is and always has been desire. This remarkable scroll from Dunhuang, from roughly the 10th century, lays out the structure of the universe according to classical Buddhist doctrine. Near the top of the painting and near the top of our universe is the formless realm. That's a realm beyond material things and a realm beyond desire. So for us today, what really matters is the area below this, the area that we live in. So as we move down from that top ethereal layer, from the formless realm into the various heavens that are represented by the floors on this skyscraper-like pagoda, the world becomes increasingly material. Everything from here on down, gods, ghosts, animals, humans, hell beings, is driven by one overriding force, and that force is desire. The levels, the stories of this giant pagoda are filled with gods who are themselves subject to desire. And down below this is where we are, we humans, on one small continent in a vast universe. And we too are a part of the desire realm, driven by our urges. And below us, of course, are the hells. Hell beings are so consumed by desire that their minds are occupied by little else. But we too, as humans, are, of course, subject to desire. Our daily urges informing innumerable decisions throughout our lives. A moment's reflection reveals that this insight is true for all of us. Our day-to-day actions are inspired by all sorts of desires, including desire for sensual pleasure, desire for fame, desire for revenge on our enemies, desire for the possession of objects, and so on. Now, another way of illustrating the importance of desire for our world is in Buddhist descriptions of the origin of this whole world system. And this is where food comes in. The world system, the entire structure here on the left, runs in cycles. Now, still according to classical Buddhist cosmology, over vast stretches of time, the world is created and eventually collapses and is destroyed, only to be created once again. According to a story most famous today from the Pali version, the Aganya Sutta, but also known from early on in Chinese, at the beginning of one of these cycles of creation of the world, before there were humans, the first beings to populate our world were godlike creatures who descended to earth from a higher realm. This was a time before food. These first beings to inhabit the earth did not need to eat or drink, since they fed on joy. They ate joy. They lived on earth in peace, beautiful, equal, easily satisfied. Unfortunately, they were gradually transformed into human beings when they surrendered to their desires. But what kind of desire triggered our descent from these glorious, glowing deities to the grubbing sacks of meat we are today. It wasn't sex, it wasn't ambition, that all comes later. Instead, the fall from a higher state of being was caused by a taste for the pleasures of food, our most basic, most persistent daily urge from the moment of our birth to the day of our death. The fatal moment came when those first earthlings, those glowing beings, at the end of one cycle and beginning of the next, were no longer satisfied to eat joy. They started to eat food. Specifically, they discovered a kind of edible crust appearing on the ground, which they decided was quite tasty. And so one of these creatures made the mistake of eating it and taking pleasure in it. And from that moment on, they lost their glow and took on crude physical forms in their greedy scramble for more and more food. They began to gather food to distinguish between the rich who had more food and the poor who had less. Their physical forms changed. Some became beautiful and some were ugly. They became greedy and hateful and violent and proud. In short, all of the sins and sufferings that are a part of human existence began with that first fatal decision to eat. Now, this story shares similarities with the biblical origin story of Adam and Eve biting from that apple. There, too, the first great mistake humans made involved eating. In the case of the Bible, eating the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. It's not just this one story in one Buddhist text, though. Food in Buddhist thought in general is usually a source of craving and a distraction from more worthwhile pursuits. So food, in other words, in Buddhist texts, is nothing but trouble. We see this same suspicion of food in the biography of the Buddha, though here with a different kind of nuance. So this statue, which I'm sure is familiar to all of you, or this genre of statues, represents the stage in the Buddha's life after he left the palace. This is his period of extreme renunciation. The Buddha practiced renunciation of food to such an extent that he was physically weakened and on the verge of starvation. Now, what's the lesson in that episode? The lesson there is that the Buddha needed to reject the craving for food in order to become a Buddha. The implication is that enjoying sensual pleasures, like even food, is a distraction from the pursuit of enlightenment. But, of course, the Buddha soon realized that he could not practice while suffering from extreme hunger, because hunger, too, can be a distraction from the pursuit of higher things. And so the Buddha began to practice the famous middle way, eating enough to support his spiritual quest, but no more. In short, food in Buddhist texts is a necessary evil. We need it to sustain ourselves, but ideally, we should not crave it. We should be indifferent to its flavor. And at times, Buddhist texts compare food to medicine and refer to food as medicine. That is, we need to take it, but it should not be an object of desire. We should ideally take no pleasure from food. The ideal monk in most Indian Buddhist texts eats what he is given, indifferent to its quality or taste. And the same suspicion of food is very common in writings by later Chinese monks as well, from medieval thinkers like Zhi Yi to modern Buddhist thinkers. That is, food is a distraction. It's better to eat what is in front of you without regard for how it tastes. Now, this is about food in general. That is, the purpose of food should simply be to sustain oneself, not to find pleasure in it. In that case, does the content of food matter? When I just said that the monks should eat whatever is put in front of them. In this context, the most famous type of food discussed is meat. In most Buddhist countries today, monastics do eat meat, but others don't. Other Buddhist monks and nuns insist on vegetarianism. Why is there this inconsistency across the Buddhist world today? The answer lies in part in the interpretation of the concept represented by our second character, by ye, or karma. The role of karma in thinking about food is more complicated than it might seem. At least it's more complicated than I initially thought it would be. If we read a range of Buddhist writings on food and karma, a number of problems emerged. So for today, I just picked these 4 karmic problems with food. Eating is not killing, the relationship between butchers and those who eat the meat. A couple of problems I'm summarizing with the words chickens, eggs, and elephants. And finally, how karma works for individuals and how it works for groups of people. So we begin with eating is not killing. The classical understanding of the relation between karma and food centers on killing. That is, if I do not kill the animal, and the animal is not killed expressly for me, then there should be nothing wrong with me eating its flesh. It's the person who killed the animal that reaps the bad karma. So we can see this in various texts, but we can also see it in medieval depictions of the court of the underworld, the netherworld. According to a popular idea of the afterlife in East Asia, when we die, we are brought before judges who determine our next rebirth. Now, these judges have various tools for evaluating the actions we took when we were humans. My favorite of these tools is the karmic mirror. So this is another Dunhuang painting from roughly the 10th century. It shows a man who has died and is now facing this karma mirror. The mirror shows his actions in life. And in this case, what he sees is not good. So I don't know if you can make that out with the light here, but if you look closely, you can just see him holding over his head an axe. Can you see that? Eating that. Right here is the axe. He's about to kill this ox. Here's another one. There are a series of these. I've collected these. There's at least one of these images where the mirror shows a man raising his fist and beating a monk, about to punch a monk. But in most of them, the man is killing an ox. Now, in Chinese religion, killing an ox is especially bad. But what I want to emphasize here is that these images always show the killer, the sinner, killing the animal. So none of them shows a man simply eating meat. The implication is that the hunters and the butchers are those who suffer the consequences of killing animals. The rest of us, since we aren't directly involved in the slaughter, are kind of off the hook, and we can eat meat without suffering karmic consequences. As long as we don't kill animals in our life, after death, we can look into that mirror unafraid of what we'll see. But in the first centuries of the Common Era, few Mahayana scriptures went a step further, claiming that the Buddha had in fact endorsed complete vegetarianism for everyone. Now, according to this new view, it doesn't matter if you killed the animal or someone else did. Good Buddhists, these new scriptures argued, should not eat meat. This second line, butchers and eaters shows a shift in emphasis from the one who kills the animal to the one who consumes it. So debates in China in the 5th and 6th centuries around the court of Emperor Wu of Liang Wudi resulted in the position that all monastics, and ideally lay people too, should be vegetarians. Among the crucial new points in these debates was the argument that even when we don't kill an animal, by eating meat, we are contributing indirectly to the animal's death. And so we suffer karmic consequences along with those butchers and hunters that we support. This is a core and complex ethical problem. At what point are we responsible for actions that are linked to our own, even distantly? So philosophers of food ethics today grapple with these same questions, not just for meat, but for world hunger, climate change, pollution, labor exploitation, and many other problems tied to food. That is, as soon as we sit down to eat, we link ourselves to a long and increasingly complicated chain of events with far-ranging consequences. Okay, chickens, eggs, and elephants. Here I'm referring to more specifically Buddhist ethical quandaries related to food and karma. There are two problems here. First, is it better to eat one elephant than two chickens, since the elephant is only one life and the chickens would be two lives? If we aren't ready to be full vegetarians, would we be better off eating pork or beef instead of, say, fish, since we get more meat per life with big animals? Buddhaghosa argued the opposite. He argued instead, saying that it is worse to eat an elephant, since it takes more sustained intention to kill an elephant than to kill chickens, much less fish. So this is because in calculating karma, intention is key. And it takes a lot of effort to kill an elephant, not so much effort to kill a fish. So for the same reason that it is worse to trap and kill a tiger, karmically, than to accidentally, say, step on an ant, it is better to eat several smaller animals than one large one. So this is the argument about big animals versus small animals. Unfortunately, Chinese commentators didn't have much to say about the chicken-elephant problem. I'm still looking for more evidence that they discussed this. They were, however, very interested in the egg question. Does eating eggs incur bad karma? Is it okay to eat eggs? Is an egg alive? Now, some argue that there's no problem in eating eggs, since eggs are not yet sentient beings. This soon involves questions of the mechanism of rebirth and the nature of consciousness. When is a thing alive? And there are some similarities here to modern discussion of abortion. Moreover, some Buddhists argued that even if an egg is a sentient being, is it perhaps an act of compassion to kind of hurry it along to its next life, allowing this chicken to avoid a life of suffering as a chicken? Chinese Buddhists from the 5th century to modern times never entirely resolved the egg problem. So I've found lots of evidence off and on of monks still eating eggs even into modern times. Interestingly also, it's only recently that there's been discussion of the propriety of eating milk products, of is it okay to eat yogurt and drink milk? Traditionally, I think this is probably because there's so many references to milk products in Indian scriptures. So Chinese Buddhists didn't see a problem with eating yogurt or drinking milk, since the Buddha probably ate yogurt and drank milk, right? So the fourth ethical problem with karma and food concerns individuals and collectives. So some Buddhists argued, especially in the 20th century, for a kind of collective karma, that when the majority of a community, not everyone, but the majority of a community behaves badly, there are consequences for the entire community. This goes back to the medieval Chinese apocryphal text, the Sutra for Humane Kings, the Renwangjing, but it's an idea that became especially popular among leading monks in modern times. Now, according to this theory, when the majority of a community, or even the majority of a whole country, eats meat, killing millions of animals, it creates bad karma that results in suffering for the entire community or for an entire nation. Floods, earthquakes, crime, and disease. So all of those angry animals, tortured and killed for our pleasure, come back seeking revenge on the society that made them suffer in previous lives. In other words, according to this theory, eating meat is not just a problem for me as an individual, because my actions affect the society that I am a part of. So this concept too has parallels in the way modern ethicists talk about food choices. So in sum then, karma is central to most Buddhist discussion about food, but it's not as straightforward as it first appears, leaving many problems unsolved even after centuries of debate. So food, it turns out, is a rich area for philosophical debate and speculation in Buddhist writing and elsewhere. The next word is ki, but I'm going to mention it only briefly. And that's tsi, or compassion. In the earliest discussion of food and the reasons for avoiding meat, the focus is entirely on the consequences for humans. But in those same 5th and 6th century debates about vegetarianism, we can trace the increasing importance given to compassion for animals. Interestingly, this theme first becomes prominent in the writings of Buddhist lay people. The key difference here is that the focus is on animal suffering, the foundation of most modern ethical discussions about vegetarianism. In other words, from these 5th and 6th century debates, we see a shift from a human-centered view to a more empathetic view that takes the suffering of animals seriously and recognizes that their experience matters even when it doesn't affect us humans. Okay, given the concerns with desire, karma, and compassion, it's easier to understand the emphasis on vegetarianism in Chinese Buddhism. But vegetarianism in Buddhism is about more than meat. Vegetarian cooking, for example, does not typically allow for alcohol. And I think it's easy to understand the Buddhist unease with alcohol, in that you drink alcohol and that leads you to commit other immoral acts. So you see the same in Islam, where Islamic thinkers will say the worst sin of all is alcohol, because once you drink enough alcohol, you commit all the other sins. Right? But in addition to alcohol, vegetarian food in East Asian tradition also contains no garlic or onions. What's wrong with garlic? Garlic has no consequences for karma. It has nothing to do with compassion. I found one reference in a medieval Buddhist text to the theory that garlic is an aphrodisiac, that garlic increases our desire for sex. And this would be convincing. It would bring us back to that first term, the desire. That is, in the same way that alcohol is dangerous because it leads to other sins, garlic is dangerous since it encourages lust. Now, it turns out that this is a myth. Scientific modern studies have demonstrated that, as far as we can tell, garlic is not, in fact, an aphrodisiac. But more importantly, in the Buddhist tradition, this explanation is very rare and never seems to have been common. Instead, much more common is the idea that garlic and the other spices forbidden in Buddhist texts are somehow impure. This is true socially and ritually for similar reasons. I had I don't know if I'd call it an argument, a discussion with a leading nun in Hong Kong a few years ago. And I am a vegetarian, but I like garlic. And I was trying to convince her that Buddhists should also eat garlic because it's related to these ideas of purity. It's not about karma. And she listened to me politely and then said, "You know nothing about communal life." The idea being that in your these enclosed monastery, you don't want to be around a bunch of people who smell like garlic. And I had to recognize that, yes, she was correct. So in other words, there was a practical component for avoiding garlic for groups of people living together. This same thirst for purity, though, applies to offerings to Buddhist deities. The bodhisattvas and other Buddhist deities are pure and do not want impure food. So this is true for Buddhism. It's also true for Taoist deities, too, are vegetarians. One doesn't include garlic in offerings to Buddhas. And this has, though not, in that case, really nothing to do with karma or compassion or even with communal living. Right? It is instead related to these ideas of purity. And so in Buddhist offerings and Taoist offerings, there's no meat, there's also no alcohol, no garlic, and no onions in China. Incidentally, purity is an important factor in other forms of traditional vegetarianism, and in ancient Greece and in Europe as well. And vegetarianism in India today is fundamentally about ritual purity and caste. Right? It turns out that Buddhism is not exceptional in this regard. Ideals of purity are common in arguments for vegetarianism throughout the world, throughout history. In the case of Chinese literati, this ideal of pure Buddhist food becomes something a little more subtle, something different that I don't quite have a grasp of yet. Let me just give you one example of the kind of purity of vegetarianism among elite Chinese poets. So the great Tang poet Wang Wei has a poem in which he describes preparing food for monks. He writes, "Late in life, I understood the principle of purity, and day by day withdrew from the company of crowds. Waiting for the arrival of monks from a distant mountain, I first sweep out my humble abode. As expected, they arrive among the clouds, the cloud-covered peaks, espying my thatched cottage. As we sit on the grass, I feed them pine nuts." I have some sympathy for these poor monks who went to visit Wang Wei and were given nothing but pine nuts, "as we burn incense and read Buddhist books." So the poem continues, and I've collected a number of these Tang poems, Song poems in the same vein, but I think this is enough to get a sense about his ideas of what the pure life was, the purity of vegetarianism. Here, purity isn't ritual purity. With his pine nuts in his humble house, Wang Wei sees in vegetarianism a life apart from politics, a life apart from the bustle of life at the city and at court. Other famous poets, including Bai Juyi, Su Shi, Huang Tingjian, they were all attracted to vegetarianism in one way or another, not so much out of compassion for animals or a concern with karma, as they were with this kind of longing for an elegant life of simplicity and purity. And meat they associated with blood, with violence, with struggle for power. Whereas vegetarian food they associated with a pure, free life dedicated to simple pleasures. So these are the foundations for the reasoning behind Buddhist vegetarianism. Desire. Craving food is dangerous. It can lead to immoral behavior, and it is a distraction from higher pursuits. Karma. Among the immoral behaviors fueled by our hunger for food, craving food leads us to take take the lives of animals, a repeated act that produces innumerable instances of bad karma, and it contributes to trapping us in a cycle of suffering. Compassion. Regardless of the karmic consequences for us or our community, we should reduce the suffering of animals because they are weak and we have the power to help them. Finally, purity. Meat like garlic and chives and onions and asafoetida is dirty, impure, polluting. So all of this so far sounds reasonable, consistent, logical, clear, but food ethics are rarely simple. No one escapes a meal pure and ethically beyond reproach. Food ethics, I guess like most ethics in general, often involves compromise. And this brings us to our fifth and final word for the day, wei, or taste. This is the return of flavor. If you eat at a Chinese vegetarian restaurant, you are more likely than not to see meat on the menu. But the chicken and pork are in fact substitute meats made from gluten, a wheat product. The history of imitation meats, fake meats that aren't really meats, goes back, as far as I can tell, at least 1,000 years, and perhaps all the way back to the late 5th century. These fake meats were much discussed in the early 20th century by both Buddhists and by critics of Buddhist vegetarianism. The principle is based on a compromise between our first 4 words, desire, karma, compassion, and purity, and the 5th, flavor. So these dishes on this menu don't contain the forbidden garlic and onions or alcohol. And you can look at historical cookbooks from these early Chinese restaurants and see that that's been true generally for a long time. These dishes don't involve directly killing animals, but they do make a concession to taste, to our natural desire for flavor. So this is a menu from a modern Hong Kong branch of the most famous Chinese vegetarian restaurant, the Gongdelin, founded in Shanghai in the 1920s, and famous from early on for its clever meat substitutes. So if you look closely at the recipes, it includes recipes for so-called chicken, various kinds of fish, but in fact, these are all vegetarian products made to look and feel like fish, look and feel like chicken. And Buddhist leaders have at times expressed unease about these fake meat products, which have been around, as I said, for close to 1,000 years. In part because, as I mentioned earlier, karma is supposed to be as much about intention as action. So remember the problem of killing an elephant. But if you're eating a fake meat, isn't your intention really to trick your palate into thinking it's eating meat? And shouldn't this also incur bad karma? It wasn't just Buddhist leaders who criticized the fake meats. The modern novelist, the greatest modern Chinese novelist, Lu Xun, complained about what he saw as hypocrisy in the fake meats when he ate at the Hangzhou branch of the Gongdelin restaurant back in the 20s. And modern Chinese vegetarian cooking is now moving away from these products. But as a way of drawing in the skeptics or the fence sitters, bringing them into the vegetarian diet, fake meat and gastronomic ingenuity are indisputably powerful tools. So I want to illustrate this compromise with flavor, not with fake meats, but with another remarkable gastronomic invention, MSG. This is an ad for MSG from a Shanghai newspaper in 1914. So you can just make out here a kind of modern-looking couple with their one child enjoying a meal. And this was a 1914 ad in a newspaper in Shanghai. It's just a few years after MSG was invented by the chemist Ikeda Kikunae in Tokyo. And Ikeda created the first MSG, which he called Ajinomoto, and he formed a company of the same name, the Ajinomoto Corporation, which to this day is a huge corporation. MSG was an immediate hit in Japan, and as you know, eventually became a staple throughout East Asia. So this ad was part of a campaign to promote MSG in Shanghai in the early days. And it lists all the wonderful qualities of this new product above that modern couple at the bottom. But when I was reading the ad, what struck me was the last point it makes on the side, where it says, Ajinomoto, this MSG, contains no trace of meat whatsoever. Pious vegetarians can use it at their convenience. So evidently in 1914, there were enough vegetarians in Shanghai to warrant this additional hook. Now, 8 years after this, if you'll bear with me, I'll get to Buddhism in a moment. 8 years after this, the Shanghai businessman, Wu Yunshu, who became known as the king of MSG, he learned the technique for manufacturing MSG. He came up with a Chinese term for it. He called it flavor essence, or weijing. And then through clever techniques, brutal business practices, he cornered the Chinese market and pushed Ajinomoto out. But like the ad men of the Ajinomoto Corporation, Wu Yunshu also attempted to exploit the vegetarian market. Now, these efforts to convince Chinese vegetarians to start using MSG caught a lucky break when a prominent Shanghai geologist and Buddhist was visiting his Buddhist master, the great monk Yin Guang, who was one of the most famous Buddhists of his day. The geologist and Yin Guang entered into this conversation when they met on Yin Guang's monastery on an island outside of Shanghai. And the geologist explained to the great monk that there's a new product on the market that makes vegetables taste fantastic. And he said, we Buddhists really should make use of this MSG product, because once people have vegetables with MSG, they'll no longer miss meat. This will be a great product for converting all of China to vegetarianism. So Yin Guang was intrigued, and he set up a meeting where he went to an MSG factory, and he went there and he confirmed that MSG contained no animal products. And he even wrote a widely read essay on the wonders of MSG. It's an essay that captures his enthusiasm for the potential of this new weapon to win the centuries-old Buddhist battle, to convert all of China to vegetarianism. So in Yin Guang's essay, which is roughly titled, MSG Can Save the World, he writes, the quality of the product is pure, without a trace of meat. Those who want to keep a vegetarian diet can use it with confidence. He goes on, it was manufactured and distributed for the sake of profit, but in fact, it profits both men and animals. It will contribute to saving our nation, saving our people. How great the merit. So you can sense his enthusiasm for this new product. He'd spent his whole life trying to convince meat eaters to give up their meat. Finally, this was a new technology that was going to change everything. So I want to give one parallel example that can help us reflect on what was happening here. And this takes us a little bit away from vegetarianism per se, but we're still in the same ballpark. And that is Yin Guang and vegan soap. This is an ad for soap from 1947. Individually wrapped bars of soap imported from America and Europe were a popular gift in China as early as, say, the 1850s. Before that, Chinese mostly used this sort of ground beans that they'd rub on themselves to clean themselves, but it's not the same kind of sensual experience that we all have with soap, which is smooth and lathers up, right? So in the early 20th century, when this new kind of soap went from being an exotic luxury item to a staple of the everyday middle-class households, it created a problem for Buddhists. The problem was that the new soap required fat. The technical term is fat that was saponified with caustic lye. So the cheapest way to get fat into soap is to use animal fat. And that's still true today. Most cheap soap is made with animal fat. So if we look at another ad in this same 1947 paper, we find a smaller ad for a different kind of soap. And I think the different size of the ad probably reflects a different budget. So you can make soap using vegetable fat or coconut oil instead of animal fat, but it's just more expensive. In the early 20th century, there was a series of Buddhist business ventures attempting to manufacture and sell vegan soap. Each one started with kind of jubilant optimism and ended in failure. There are really tight profit margins on making soap. And I think that, like I said, that's still true today. So if you want to get soap without animal fat in it, you have to pay a little more.
Great.
So Yin Guang, the monk, the same monk who supported MSG, he was equally enthusiastic about the new soaps. But what's interesting to me is the reasons he gave for promoting these vegan soaps, which is rooted in traditional Buddhist doctrine. So he wrote an essay about soap as well, where he writes, "For the sake of appetite, we capture all manner of creatures from water, land, and the air. We kill them and eat them in hopes of satisfying a temporary craving, not contemplating the fact that they share with us the same spirit. They share with us bodies of flesh and blood. They share with us awareness of pain, suffering, and pleasure. They share with us a love of life and a fear of death." So here he begins with our third word, compassion. He makes the argument from compassion. More specifically, we should feel compassion for animals, according to Yin Guang, because we are like them. All these things that we share, they share with us. And this argument for compassion because of similarity is especially powerful in the context of the Buddhist belief in rebirth. So as you can see in this is another, I love these 10th century Dunhuang images. This illustrates the 6 paths of rebirth and shows that we are not just like animals. In the past, we were animals, and in the future, we probably will be animals again. And one of the arguments that Buddhists in China made traditionally from medieval times on is that we should not eat meat since the animal we eat may in a past life have been our mother or our father. Yin Guang continues, "Simply because they do not have the strength to withstand us, we kill and eat them. How could this not cause them to harbor resentment towards us, such that in the future they will seek revenge? Thinking of these things, do you not tremble with fear?" So here he turns from compassion to karma. This is a very personal understanding of karma, in which individuals harmed in one life seek out revenge in the next. And we are, according to Yin Guang, surrounded by the reincarnations of animals killed for their flesh in previous existences, now filling the world with anger, resentment, and violence. Elsewhere, he even attributes war, disease, flooding, all of the problems of the early 20th century to the Chinese avarice for meat. Now, the video I started with is an ad for a modern Buddhist vegetarian restaurant in Taiwan. We can see the same enthusiastic but ultimately kind of uneasy relationship between tradition and modernity in vegetarian restaurants that I just talked about in making the case for MSG and vegan soap. Evidence for vegetarian restaurants in China goes back to late medieval times, but the boom in urban vegetarian restaurants really started in the early 20th century. Some Buddhists praised the efforts of the new vegetarian restaurants for attracting meat eaters to their cause by offering all kinds of delicious, varied food that would be suitable for weddings, banquets, and other occasions that traditionally called for the consumption of large amounts of meat. But others, both Buddhists and non-Buddhists, objected that the vegetarian restaurants had already gone too far, and they neglected some Buddhist ideals in order to achieve other Buddhist ideals. That is, the high-end vegetarian restaurant complies with 3 of our 5 words: karma, compassion, and to some extent purity, but compromises with the first and last terms, desire and taste. Now, historical details aside, my overall message, if I have an overall message from today, is that 1, if we look closely enough, we can understand aspects of the history of Buddhist thought, belief, and practice through food. So I would like to teach at some point an introduction to Buddhism that is food-based, and see how much of Buddhism can you talk about by starting with food. My second message for today is that we can use Buddhist materials to think through food ethics on a broader scale. So I'd be happy to take any questions, and especially any suggestions for what I'm missing in this brief overview of what matters in the history of Buddhist food. Thank you.
Okay, so we now would like to receive some questions from the audience.
It was a very interesting talk, and actually I don't have any real suggestions, but just the other day, and I'm sure you're familiar with that, I was reading Dogen's Eihei Shingi, and he has this famous passage where he arrives in China, and the cook from Tiantung Monastery comes especially to the ship to seek out any special Japanese, I think it was shiitake mushrooms, right? So that I think is probably shows you how far they went in terms of flavor.
Right.
So that's the only thing I can remember. But my question is, you mentioned the debates during the Liang dynasty, that there was a shift towards not just blaming the killers, but also the eaters. Could you explain perhaps a bit more how that came about? Was there any probably pre-Buddhist tradition of vegetarianism in China that influenced this? I wonder if you could give some more
Those are
information.
both really interesting points. The first is that sort of elevation of the cook in Dogen's writing, that the cook really becomes an important figure in his piece, which is so different from the representation of cooking in the Vinaya, in the monastic regulations, where there wasn't even supposed to be a kitchen in the monastery. It's supposed to be outside the monastery. So it's kind of an interesting shift in the value given to the cook. And then on the second one, there are kind of vegetarian tendencies before Buddhism. It's quite difficult to interpret the language, but mostly it's as a period of mourning. So I should have had another word here, something about renunciation, or I should have found a word for asceticism, because that's also, maybe that fits in with desire. So that was the idea that when your parents die, you should not eat meat. And there's a passage by Zhu Xi which says that when your parents die, you should not eat meat, but you should definitely serve meat to guests. So that shows it's not about karma, it's not about compassion for the animals, it's about renouncing the pleasure of meat. And then where this idea comes from in those debates is interesting. It doesn't come from monks, because monks were, for the most part, arguing in those debates that they should be allowed to, it's acceptable for them to eat meat. It was for these very creative lay followers who I think it's an original moment of them thinking through the implications of me buying meat from a butcher, that aren't I in some way complicit in that act? That's where I am right now. I haven't written that chapter yet, so maybe I'll have more another year from now.
the practice is vegetarianism. Is that they have as a common is a personal characters or any good things to do. The things that's us.
Yeah, so that's actually another one. So maybe instead of using heritage, this relates to that last question. It's also identity. That by eating differently, you mark yourself off as a separate community. So at least for Chinese monastics, it meant, shaving the hair, wearing monastic robes. They changed the name and begin to eat vegetarian food once that becomes a part of their identity. So if I was going to add a sixth word, I don't know what the Chinese word for rentong, you can't say it in one word, but the word I should add should be identity. Right, so that's a good point. Thank you.
I had a number of questions myself.
Oh, okay.
So I guess one of them is, I think in the mainstream Buddhist texts, the types of meat that are forbidden also include a horse.
Right.
I think the argument they give is that horses and elephants are noble animals that have intellect. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, that there's a whole list, I remember, of taboo meats, even in mainstream texts. Right.
Then my first question was it's about the fake meat in modern Chinese Buddhist.
Yeah.
So because when I first ran into one of those, my impression was that maybe this was like educational, because you could imagine how people can use that to sort of make a point that everything is like illusion. It looks like that meat like meat, but they're not in fact. They taste like meat, but they're not meat. I was wondering if you came across that.
That's a really sophisticated understanding of what's happening. I've never come across that. So usually it's, you have descriptions of these vegetarian feasts in Chinese novels, Mingqing novels too. And there it's often for lay people who are only vegetarian like twice a month or for short periods of time. So it really does seem as if they're trying to establish kind of continuity with the standard meat diet. I've never seen this explanation that it's illustrating Buddhist principles. That's kind of fun. Yeah.
Last question is about the 5 pungent vegetables. So I know that, and I ask this because I know that we have an expert in Indian philosophy in this room. So I think that Jains, they also are forbidden from consuming onions and garlic. Are those two customs related in a way?
Yeah, I think this just emerges out of Indian ideas of purity. That's where, and I think that's also, like I say, so that's interesting because it's true for garlic, chives, asafoetida, these various things, and it also applies equally to meat. It's often not really so much about animal suffering or karma as it is about blood being polluting. So there's definitely a ritual aspect, especially in India. When I've given this, I gave a talk a year ago on this vegetarianism in China, and an Indian student came up to me afterwards and said, yeah, in India, it's all caste. It's all about caste. So it's about ritual purity, was his argument. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. Actually, I'm curious about your title. You mentioned 5 food in your title, and discussed desire, karma, and compassion, and purity and taste.
Right.
So it felt to me as if Buddhism treats these concepts not merely as ethical categories, but as resources or nutrient, as if desire, karma, compassion, purity, and taste themselves become forms of nourishment within the Buddhist understanding of food. Is there a special significance or intention behind the use of these words in your title, firstly? And second, would it also be possible to extend this your discussion to include Buddhist context where meat consumption is permitted or even ritualized, such as in tantric tradition?
Oh. Well, tantric tradition's interesting because it's kind of reversing all of this. It's precisely because you have these set traditions that by subverting it, they become powerful. So that's an interesting argument. But you also suggested that meat-eating traditions, maybe that aren't even Buddhist, like outside, I'm not sure if that's what you were getting at, but I'm quite interested just in the history of meat in general. And in China, at least, it wasn't about caste, but definitely about class, that meat was a sign of social status. And I think that's where a lot of the power came from for monks renouncing meat, because it's renouncing these expressions of high social status. That's not quite what you were asking, but I think that's one direction to take that. And as for why these 5 terms, they're just 5 terms I thought of. They don't come out of the tradition in particular. That's why I'm asking, what else am I missing? So I've already got a few. At least identity should be there, and maybe something related to social status. Yep.
I just came from India and Nepal, and then what I observed in Nepal was like people consume meat a lot, even though they have a Lumbini where Buddha was birthed there. And so while I was listening to the lecture today, I was wondering that if the karma that you're talking about is like started getting more importance in China, or like is it related between 2 countries? And also I have one more question. I am also a yoga teacher, and I am teaching a yoga related to like Ayurvedic diet. I would like to highlight how people should know about their body type, and depends on the type of their bodies, what to consume. Like I would like to teach this by teaching yoga. But in Ayurveda, sweet flavor is classified as rajasic. Rajasic is like the foods which stimulate your emotions, or it's classified as inflammation. So in Buddhism, I want to know how they are like classifying this sweet flavor.
Yeah, so there are 2 big questions there. One is the big historical question, which is how China and the rest of East Asia stand out from the previous tradition by giving such an emphasis to vegetarianism. So it's really China that's different from what you see in most of South Asia, what you see for the most part Tibet, Nepal, Southeast Asia. And then Japan and Korea are something else because of shifts in modern times, especially in Japan in the beginning of the 20th century, which went from at least having an ideal of vegetarianism to abandoning that ideal entirely. So that's the big historical shift. And one of the arguments, I'm not sure how convincing it was, but one of the arguments I was trying to make is that part of the reason for those differences in different regions is their different interpretations of how karma works in the case of meat. For the second question, I'm very interested in the connection between vegetarianism and medicine in China, because food and medicine are really closely connected. There's a long tradition of that in China, but it's been quite difficult for me to find Buddhist discussion of the nutritive properties of different kinds of food. I think that may be because especially elite Buddhist writers just felt uncomfortable talking about food with that level of detail. They felt that somehow Buddhists shouldn't be discussing food in that way, but there may be more there. So I would like to find it, and I'm very interested in that connection. I just don't know much about it right now. Thank you.
I forgot the name of the scholar, but there's one who's working on Buddhist medicine.
Pierce Salguero, you mean?
He's based in Singapore. Steven, he works with like Vinaya texts.
Nick Witkowski?
No. His first name's Steven.
Stephen. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, okay. So he worked at the same university where he
Okay.
So my question was, is there any overlap between the discourse on food in Buddhism and the discourse on medicine in Buddhism, because you like what do you need and because you consume both of them.
Right, right. And even like I've mostly looked at medicine as a metaphor for eating. You know, so if you eat at inappropriate times, monks can eat at afternoon and other inappropriate times if they call it medicine. Right, so it's used as a kind of a metaphor. That's what I talked about here. But specifically, this comes back to the previous question of particular types of food that are eaten to treat particular types of sicknesses. That's something I need to look into more closely. He may talk about that. I'm not sure.
Is it also important that you are not stimulated by the food? Because they are restricting the consume of garlic and onions because it makes more sexual desires and this kind of thing.
Yeah, so that's I found only one reference to that in all the literature that I read. One reference to this idea that Buddhism that garlic stimulates the passions. So it wasn't a common argument. And I wonder if that's an argument that's more common maybe in modern times than traditionally, at least in China. The main reason given for not eating garlic is that it's forbidden by Buddhist texts. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for your very interesting presentation. I actually just finished a yoga retreat in Nepal, and when I was there was also a doctor, like nutrition specialist, who taught us about anatomy and medicine and diet, of course. And actually, what he said was that usually, traditionally, yogis should be vegetarian, but nowadays, since our lifestyle has changed a lot, so he encouraged us to consume meat, to perhaps for the protein or for other chemical substances. So I'm just wondering, in Buddhism, are there any evolution? Like in the past, perhaps people couldn't eat that, but nowadays, maybe there are some changes or transformation in terms of being a vegetarian?
That's part of what makes studying the modern period so interesting, is that there's so many different views. So you see, especially in the 1920s, 1930s in China, the newspapers are full of this kind of discussion. Lots of discussion about nutrition, with some arguing for meat, some arguing against meat. There was lots of international discussion at the time. There were anarchists who promoted vegetarianism because they opposed all forms of exploitation. So you just have this wide variety of different people with different views. And I think, I'm not sure if it's just the material or if it's in part because of these exchange of ideas all around the world that you have that much discussion. But precisely what you said was one of the justifications for Japanese Buddhist monastics to start eating meat. This idea that meat is necessary for healthy bodies, for good health. Right? And incidentally, there's this great passage in Gandhi's autobiography, where because he grew up vegetarian and he was determined to, combat these British imperialists, but he saw that the British are stronger than we Indians. So together with some of his friends one night, they got a hold of some meat and ate it and got very sick, because I don't know where they got their meat from. But it was the same idea, the idea that meat makes you strong and therefore it's necessary. And one other example of that are the Shaolin monks who fight, the Shaolin martial artist monks. They are not really monks, and they eat meat out of the belief that it's necessary for them to eat meat in order to be good fighters. Which makes
it is really interesting that you did a yoga retreat in Nepal. And what I learned in India is we distinguish the yogic diet and Ayurvedic diet. So in Ayurveda, you can eat meat, but you have to know the type of your body, depends on the doshas, which is called Prakriti. And in yogic diet, the alcohol and animal products, everything is prohibited. So it really depends on what you believe, and it really depends on what you want to do for your body. And yes, thank you.
Something that occurred to me because, before actually visiting Korea, I had a very idealized picture of vegetarian monks, but many monks are only vegetarian in the temple and in ritual setting, but outside, a lot of them don't care about. So I just wonder, also maybe it's good to think about how far this is about image making, about ritual propriety, and how it is actually practiced in Chinese temple land.
Yeah, that's a great lesson from ethnography, right? When you find out what people are actually doing. Another example is from Dunhuang, where you find a lot of monks are drinking alcohol, that monks were married, that, so that it's very difficult when you're reading the pre-modern sources to determine the degree to which these principles were widely followed. That's one big problem. The other big problem for me is that poor people don't eat meat traditionally, or very little. And so does that count as vegetarianism if you would like to eat meat but you can't afford it? I don't think it does, but those are two issues that I'm grappling with all the time. Yeah.
I'm just wondering about your personal diet preferences and what's your, if you are...
My personal diet. Oh.
Because your topic is about Buddhism food, so I'm just wondering, are you vegetarian? And
my personal diet is not very interesting, I have to say. I think that my research is more interesting than my personal diet. But yeah, I've been a vegetarian for 40 something years. But for me, the inspiration was it was more of a concern at the time. This would have been in the early 1980s with food equity, distribution of food throughout the world, and environmental concerns, because raising beef is a very inefficient way to produce food. That was my initial motivation. But there are people who have written on this much more eloquently than I have, certainly.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Professor Kieschnick again for his illuminating talk. And thank you, everyone. Thank you.